There are moments in history that are never written in textbooks, events so carefully concealed that even time itself seems afraid to speak their name. In the summer of 1954, in a quiet Dutch village surrounded by pine forests, cars with tinted windows began to arrive one by one. No flags, no press, no explanations, just silence. And behind that silence, a gathering that would change the world forever. For 4 days, inside a secluded hotel named the Bilderberg, the most powerful men on earth met behind locked doors. Politicians, bankers, royals, and industrial magnates all united under a single chilling idea: to shape a new global order. No journalists were allowed, no minutes were taken, and those who spoke about it simply vanished from the record. Officially, it was just a conference to promote cooperation between Europe and America. But unofficially, whispers began to spread that this meeting wasn't about diplomacy, it was about control. The control of information, the control of markets, the control of governments. In the years that followed, wars were redirected, currencies were rewritten, and nations began to move in sync as if following an invisible hand. Some called it coincidence, others called it destiny. But those who truly paid attention knew it all began here. Tonight, you and I will uncover what really happened behind those doors in Oosterbeek. The names, the deals, the decisions that reshaped humanity's path. Because if what was born that day still rules the world today, then understanding the past might be the only way to survive the future. The world remembers 1954 as a year of post-war recovery. Nations were rebuilding, economies stabilizing, and the public believed peace had finally returned. But in the shadows of this optimism, far from the eyes of the press, a different kind of alliance was being forged, one that would quietly decide the fate of nations for generations to come. The meeting took place in a hotel named the Bilderberg, a picturesque place surrounded by trees, birdsong, and calm. Yet behind its closed doors, conversations were anything but peaceful. Witnesses spoke of strict security, guards positioned at every corridor, and men who spoke in whispers, their faces tense, their motives hidden behind diplomatic smiles. No one outside those walls knew who attended or what was being decided. But everyone inside knew they were not there to discuss ideas, they were there to build power. As the years passed, the name Bilderberg would become synonymous with secrecy, control, and conspiracy. Some called it a myth. Others called it proof that the global elite had united under one common agenda. Documents would later surface, suggesting that policies shaping global finance, military cooperation, and even population control began there. That very weekend in Oosterbeek. The question we must ask is not whether the meeting happened, it did. The question is, what was truly born inside those walls? Before we uncover the chilling truth behind the Bilderberg meeting, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments from which country and city you're watching this story. Because the next few minutes will take you into a world of secrecy, manipulation, and decisions that still echo through every government, every economy, and every life on Earth. In the years following World War II, Europe was a continent in ruins. Cities were reduced to ashes, empires had fallen, and the old world order was collapsing. But among the rubble, a new power was rising, one not defined by borders or armies, but by influence, finance, and control. It was during this fragile moment in history that an invitation began to circulate, written on elegant stationery and delivered only to a chosen few. No public announcement, no trace in newspapers. The message was simple but cryptic. You are invited to discuss the future of Western civilization. The sender was Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, a man whose charm and connections extended from royal courts to the headquarters of multinational corporations. Officially, he was a philanthropist concerned with peace and cooperation. Unofficially, he was the perfect intermediary between power and secrecy. His invitation was signed with the utmost discretion, bearing no seal of government, no official insignia. Only the location, Hotel de Bilderberg, Oosterbeek, and the dates, May 29th to 31st, 1954. At first glance, the guest list seemed innocent enough. Politicians, economists, military strategists, and academics. But a deeper look revealed something unsettling. Many of these names belonged to the same families that had financed both sides of the war. Others represented banking dynasties, oil empires, and media conglomerates that had quietly expanded while nations bled. They were the architects of influence, the kind of men who didn't attend meetings. They commanded them. When the invitations reached their destinations, responses came quickly. Some accepted immediately, drawn by curiosity. Others hesitated, sensing that this was no ordinary conference. There were whispers among diplomats in Washington and London that the meeting had the backing of intelligence agencies. Some said the CIA had played a role in its organization. Others claimed it was the brainchild of financiers disparate to prevent future revolutions. But one thing was certain: whoever attended would be stepping into something larger than themselves. As the date approached, private planes began to land quietly in Dutch airfields. Cars with black-tinted windows moved through the countryside, escorted by discreet police officers who claimed to know nothing. Local newspapers noticed unusual activity, but were ordered not to publish anything. Hotel staff received strict instructions: no questions, no photographs, and no entry to the main conference room under any circumstance. The entire hotel was sealed from the public eye. Inside the Bilderberg Hotel, preparations were meticulous. Each seat was assigned, each window covered, and each conversation recorded by men who were never named. A private dining hall was transformed into a conference room where the most powerful voices on Earth would soon decide the framework of global cooperation or domination. No one outside the room would ever know the exact details of what was said. For many attendees, the meeting was an opportunity to influence decisions before they became public, to shape the post-war balance of power in a way that favored their interests. But for a smaller circle within the group, this gathering represented something far greater: the birth of a new ideology. A world where decisions would no longer depend on governments, but on consensus among those who truly ruled, the economic elite. The first day began with polite introductions and prepared speeches. By the second, the atmosphere shifted. Discussions became intense, and agreements were made in hushed tones. The line between democracy and manipulation began to blur. Attendees debated how to align Europe and the United States under one economic vision, one currency, one trade system, one unified strategy. They called it integration. Others would later call it global control. Prince Bernhard moved through the rooms like a conductor leading a symphony. He greeted each guest personally, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. But behind his smile, there was purpose. He knew that this meeting, once complete, would mark the beginning of something irreversible. Something that would outlive every government and every politician present. By the final night, the tone was set. Agreements were not signed on paper, but sealed through understanding. The world outside would continue believing in democracy and independence. Yet, inside that quiet hotel in Oosterbeek, the blueprint for a new era had been drawn. When the attendees left, they didn't take documents with them, they carried ideas. Ideas powerful enough to reshape the planet without a single vote cast. And when the last car disappeared into the foggy Dutch night, the silence that followed was not the end. It was the beginning, the first heartbeat of what would soon be known as the New World Order. Oosterbeek was a quiet village in the Dutch countryside, surrounded by forests and gentle rivers, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else. Its residents were used to silence, the occasional hum of a bicycle, the distant ringing of church bells. But in late May of 1954, the air changed. The locals noticed black cars moving through narrow roads at dawn, their engines muffled, their license plates unfamiliar. Strangers filled the small hotels nearby, men in long coats who spoke little and looked at everyone with suspicion. Something was happening, but no one dared to ask what. At the entrance of the Hotel de Bilderberg, guards in dark suits stood like statues. They weren't soldiers, but their discipline was unmistakable. Each guest that arrived was checked, not by uniformed officers, but by men carrying small folders with photographs and coded lists. Cameras were forbidden. Even the hotel's phone lines were rerouted to an external control center. For the next 4 days, the place would be cut off from the outside world. The first arrivals came from London and Washington politicians who spoke the language of diplomacy but moved like men under orders. Among them was Joseph Ratzinger, a Polish political advisor and one of the main architects of European integration. His presence gave legitimacy to the meeting, but his reputation for secrecy made others uneasy. Shortly after came Dean Rusk, then a rising figure in American foreign policy, and the former Prime Minister of Belgium, Paul van Zeeland. Each guest brought their own agenda, but they all shared one understanding: the less said, the better. Reporters from local newspapers tried to approach the hotel, but were quickly turned away by polite but firm Dutch police. One journalist from De Telegraaf managed to photograph a few cars entering the property before being escorted off the premises. The photos were confiscated the same day. The public explanation? A private international conference, but no one could find out who had organized it or why such high-profile figures were meeting in a town most had never even heard of. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and tense. The walls of the main conference room were lined with heavy curtains to block both light and sound. A long oval table occupied the center, covered with notes, maps, and folders labeled restricted. Nameplates were simple, listing only surnames. Attendees addressed each other by first name only, a symbolic gesture meant to erase nationality, rank, and public title. They were not there as representatives of countries. They were there as something else, members of a growing class without borders. The waiters and hotel staff were instructed to serve food without speaking to the guests. Even the cleaning personnel were replaced by selected agents fluent in multiple languages, trained to notice everything but say nothing. The sense of control was absolute. Every word uttered in that room would be protected as if it were a state secret. Outside, the citizens of Oosterbeek began to speculate. Some said it was a NATO operation. Others whispered that royalty from across Europe had come to discuss a new economic alliance. An elderly woman living near the hotel claimed she saw men in military coats carrying briefcases late at night. Another swore she heard strange mechanical noises coming from the property after midnight, as if machines were being tested. Nobody could confirm anything, but the feeling that something monumental was happening spread through the village like an invisible fog. Meanwhile, inside those walls, the introductions had ended and the real conversations had begun. Discussions about oil prices, trade routes, and military cooperation quickly turned to deeper, darker questions. How could nations be guided toward unity without realizing it? How could global markets be stabilized under one coordinated plan? And above all, how could this plan remain hidden from the public eye? Every participant had something to gain. For some, it was access to intelligence networks and private funding. For others, it was the chance to influence policies that would outlast their lifetimes. But for the few who truly understood what was being created, it was about something more profound: control over the direction of human civilization itself. As the first day drew to a close, a storm began to roll across the Dutch skies. Thunder echoed through the forest as rain fell over the quiet town. From a distance, the hotel looked like a fortress of light in the middle of the darkness. No one could see what was being said inside, but everyone could feel that something irreversible had already begun. The men inside weren't just discussing the future, they were writing it. The official agenda of the Bilderberg meeting was simple enough to disarm suspicion, promoting better understanding between Europe and America. It sounded harmless, almost noble, but those who sat behind the oval table knew that the words were nothing more than a smokescreen. The true purpose of the meeting went far beyond diplomacy or cooperation. It was about redesigning the global system, one decision at a time, hidden beneath the illusion of unity. The idea had been brewing long before 1954. During the final years of World War II, a quiet alliance had formed between industrial magnates, bankers, and intelligence officials from both sides of the Atlantic. They understood that wars were costly, unpredictable, and above all, inefficient. Real power, they realized, was not taken with armies, it was managed through economies. The Bilderberg meeting was meant to be the first step in consolidating that realization into action. Inside the room, the discussions were not about governments, but about governance. The difference was subtle, but crucial. Governments could fall. Governance could endure. They spoke of creating an interconnected system where nations would depend on shared institutions, trade agreements, central banks, international organizations that transcended borders. Control would no longer require conquest. It would operate through dependence. Dean Rusk reportedly emphasized that the stability of democracy relies on managing perception. Those words would become a silent mantra for decades to come. If people believed they were free, they would never question who wrote the rules. And so, beneath the polite conversations about cooperation, strategies were drawn for controlling public opinion through media, education, and economic pressure. The invisible hand of power would no longer hide in the shadows. It would disguise itself as freedom. A few attendees hesitated. The idea of engineering global influence through manipulation rather than negotiation was unsettling, even dangerous. But the room was filled with men accustomed to shaping history. Fear was merely a tool to be managed. And besides, the rewards were too great to ignore. If successful, they could prevent future wars, control economic collapse, and ensure a stable future, one defined by them. By the second night, the tone had changed. The polite atmosphere of diplomacy was gone. Heated debates erupted over how to unify Europe under a single economic framework. Some suggested a shared currency. Others proposed an international banking network that could regulate trade and credit between nations. The word integration appeared repeatedly in their notes, a concept that, over time, would evolve into what the world now knows as globalization. Behind these ideas stood the same families who had financed empires for centuries: Rothschild, Rockefeller, Morgan, and others whose fortunes were interwoven with the foundation of modern banking. Their representatives spoke quietly, but carried more weight than any politician in the room. Their goal wasn't conquest, it was continuity. To ensure that wealth, power, and information flowed upward, never outward. Outside the walls of the Bilderberg Hotel, Europe was still recovering from the ashes of war. People spoke of rebuilding, of freedom, of democracy. Yet inside that room, plans were being laid that would make nations increasingly reliant on those who controlled global finance. It was not occupation, it was orchestration. As dawn approached on the third day, Prince Bernhard reportedly called for a final closed session. Only a handful of attendees were invited. The discussion that followed would never be documented. Some say it centered around the creation of a permanent steering committee, a network of trusted individuals who would meet again, every year in different locations under absolute secrecy. Others believe it went even deeper, that they spoke of establishing a global framework of control that would extend into the next century. Whatever was said that morning, one thing became clear: the meeting in Oosterbeek was not the end of something, but the beginning. From that moment on, decisions affecting billions would be whispered by a few, hidden behind the comforting mask of democracy. The participants left with smiles and handshakes, but behind their polite farewells was the unspoken understanding that they had just set the world on a path it could never leave. The world outside would go on believing in coincidence. But history, from that day forward, would be guided by design. When the morning of May 30th arrived, the rain had stopped. The forest around the Hotel de Bilderberg was quiet again, the air heavy with mist. But inside the building, the tension was electric. The first 2 days had stripped away the formalities and small talk. The men who sat around the oval table were no longer diplomats or economists. They were architects working on a blueprint that would define the future. That morning, they were about to reach their first real agreement. The discussion began with a question that had no clear answer. How do you unite nations without telling them they are being united? To merge economies, currencies, and foreign policies without declaring an empire, without ever firing a shot? The man who raised the question was Joseph Ratzinger, the political mastermind behind the European movement. His tone was calm, but his words cut through the room like a scalpel. If you give people the illusion of choice, he said, they will never notice the plan. The proposal was simple in structure, but monumental in consequence. Europe and America would begin to align under a shared vision economically, politically, and militarily. But instead of governments enforcing this union, private influence would guide it. The foundations would be invisible. Policy groups, think tanks, philanthropic institutions, and international corporations. Each would act independently, yet all would move in the same direction. Power would no longer need to sit in a throne or office. It would exist everywhere and belong to no one. Some in the room applauded the idea, others hesitated. The British delegation warned that such coordination might appear like a conspiracy if ever exposed. The Americans disagreed, insisting that secrecy was the only way it could succeed. Public opinion must never connect the dots, one of them said. We are not hiding, we are protecting civilization from chaos. Those words would become the justification for decades of covert cooperation among the world's elites. The first agreement was not written down in any official record. There was no treaty, no signature, no seal. But witnesses described a quiet consensus to begin creating informal committees that would act as bridges between governments and corporations. These groups would hold private discussions, advise politicians, and shape international policy, all outside the reach of democratic oversight. The goal was stability. The result would be control. Prince Bernhard nodded in approval. For him, this meeting was the birth of something enduring. He proposed that such gatherings should continue annually under absolute confidentiality. Each year, they would choose a different country, a new hotel, a new front page that would reveal nothing. The attendees would change, but the mission would remain the same: to maintain balance in the global system by managing the forces that ordinary citizens could never understand. Dean Rusk added that for this system to endure, it needed legitimacy. We must make the world believe it governs itself, he said. If people think they choose their leaders, they will never look beyond the curtain. It was not cynicism, it was strategy. They would create the illusion of freedom by controlling the framework in which freedom operated. Elections would continue, laws would be passed, but the parameters of power would be set elsewhere, in rooms like this. As night fell, they gathered in the hotel's private dining hall. The conversation drifted from economics to philosophy, from religion to morality. Some spoke of the need for peace, others of responsibility. But beneath every justification lay the same belief, that only a few were capable of managing the destiny of many. They were not tyrants, at least not in their own eyes. They were guardians of order in a world they saw as dangerously chaotic. By the time the meeting adjourned, the first agreement had taken shape not as a document, but as a shared understanding. The world would move toward unification under the guidance of those who held knowledge and wealth. National governments would remain as symbols of independence, but their power would gradually erode, replaced by interdependence. The first threads of the new world order had been woven, and the men in that room were its silent weavers. Outside, the moonlight fell over Oosterbeek, casting long shadows through the trees. The guests returned to their rooms in silence, each aware that they had crossed an invisible threshold. From that night on, History would not simply unfold, it would be directed. The first agreement had been made, and the world would never again be the same. The morning after the agreement, the atmosphere inside the Bilderberg Hotel felt different. The tension had not vanished, it had deepened. Something irreversible had been set in motion, and every man in that room knew it. Now the challenge was no longer to decide what to do, but how to ensure that no one outside would ever find out. What had begun as a simple conference of elites was transforming into a permanent network of power, and power, they understood, survives only through silence. The final day of the meeting was devoted not to new plans, but to protection. Prince Bernhard opened the session with deliberate calm. "We are not conspirators," he said, "but guardians of balance. And balance requires discretion." The phrase would echo in the memories of those present. From that moment on, secrecy would not be a precaution, it would be doctrine. No official minutes, no recordings, no journalists. Every participant swore to speak of the meeting only in vague, harmless terms, if ever asked. The true details would never reach the public. To enforce this, a set of informal but absolute rules was established. They called it the Chatham House Rule, a principle that allowed participants to use the information received, but never reveal who said it or where it came from. It was a clever way to institutionalize silence without signing a single contract. Those who violated the rule would find themselves quietly removed from political circles, their influence erased, their reputations dismantled. It was an invisible punishment for an invisible crime. The decision to maintain secrecy was not driven by paranoia alone. Many in the room understood that exposure would destroy the credibility of everything they had built. If the public ever discovered that such powerful figures were shaping policy in private, the reaction would be chaos. Democracies could not survive the revelation that decisions were being coordinated outside their elected institutions. The people had to believe that leadership was spontaneous, that history was accidental. Anything else would unravel the illusion. Among the attendees, a few expressed discomfort. One American journalist who had been invited as an observer reportedly asked, "How long can you hide from the world?" The answer came from one of the bankers, spoken in a calm, almost fatherly tone. "We are not hiding, we are protecting them from the truth." That phrase, according to later rumors, was met with approving silence. The idea that secrecy was a form of protection would become the ethical foundation of the Bilderberg ethos. Outside the hotel, the local population remained curious. Strange cars still came and went, and the sound of typewriters could be heard faintly through the night. A Dutch gardener, working near the property, claimed he saw documents being burned behind the hotel, guarded by men with foreign accents. When questioned later, he said the papers had no markings, only symbols, as if drawn by hand. His story was dismissed as imagination, but whispers of his account would linger for years. After the closing session, each attendee received a coded message on official stationery. It contained no words, only a date and a symbol, a reminder of the next gathering. The symbol was said to resemble an eye within a circle, though its meaning was never explained. The message was destroyed by each recipient after reading, in accordance with the new rule. No copies were kept, no archives created. History would remember nothing because nothing was written. When the cars departed one by one from Oosterbeek, they left behind no trace of what had occurred. The hotel returned to its peaceful routine. The curtains were reopened, the staff resumed their duties, and tourists once again filled its quiet halls. But for those who had attended, the world outside no longer looked the same. They carried the silence with them, an invisible oath that would bind them to one another for the rest of their lives. That silence became the meeting's most enduring achievement. It protected them for decades, allowing the Bilderberg Group to grow in influence while remaining hidden in plain sight. Year after year, the world's most powerful figures would gather under its shadow, maintaining the illusion of distance while moving in perfect coordination. And so, what began in 1954 as a single meeting became a ritual. An unspoken covenant among elites, a silence pact that ensured one truth above all others: that power, when concealed, is eternal. For nearly 2 decades, the Bilderberg meetings continued in perfect silence. Each year, a new country, a new hotel, the same veil of secrecy. No official invitations, no public schedules, and no traceable records. Only a handful of people even knew such gatherings existed. But by the early 1970s, the cracks began to show. Whispers of a hidden network started to slip through the walls. The first leaks had begun, and the world was about to catch its first glimpse of the invisible hand guiding it. It started with journalists who didn't believe in coincidences. In 1973, a small Dutch reporter named Henk Rissenaars came across an unusual list of names politicians, bankers, and CEOs booked under aliases in the same hotel in Sweden. He followed the trail and stumbled upon the annual Bilderberg meeting. He tried to publish his findings, but his editor killed the story within hours. The reason was never given. His notes disappeared from the newsroom the following week. Around the same time, in the United States, a group of independent researchers began connecting dots between global financial policies and recurring, unofficial meetings involving the same individuals. They noticed patterns, economic shifts that followed each Bilderberg conference, market movements that seemed too synchronized to be natural. By then, the term New World Order had begun circulating among conspiracy theorists, though few realized how close they were to the truth. In 1976, something unexpected happened. A U.S. congressman named Larry P. McDonald publicly questioned the legitimacy of the Bilderberg Group, calling it an unelected government of the West. His statement gained little attention, but within months, his plane Korean Air Flight 007 was shot down under mysterious circumstances near Soviet airspace. The official explanation was human error. Those who investigated deeper were not so sure. Meanwhile, insiders began to talk. A former hotel staff member from a 1967 meeting in Germany confessed to handling documents marked for committee use only. The papers contained references to population control, currency unification, and surveillance technologies decades ahead of their time. He claimed that when security discovered he had seen them, he was threatened and forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement under military supervision. He later disappeared. His family reported him missing. He was never found. By the 1980s, the Bilderberg name had begun to leak into public awareness, mentioned in whispers by investigative journalists and fringe publications. Yet, every time someone got too close, something happened. Funding pulled, publications retracted, or reputations destroyed. Mainstream media dismissed it all as fantasy, labeling anyone who mentioned the group as a conspiracy theorist. It was a perfect defense mechanism: ridicule. After all, the easiest way to hide the truth is to bury it under laughter. One of the most infamous leaks came from inside the group itself. In 1991, during the Bilderberg meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany, a young assistant allegedly smuggled out a recording of a private discussion. The tape, according to those who heard it, captured elite figures discussing global governance and digital surveillance. The recording never surfaced publicly, but a few journalists who reported its existence claimed they were harassed, followed, and eventually silenced. One of them, a British reporter named Gordon Tether, was fired from the Financial Times after refusing to drop his investigation. The internet age changed everything. In the 1990s and early 2000s, information began to spread faster than it could be contained. Amateur researchers started posting flight manifests, hotel reservations, and guest lists online. Satellite photos revealed unusual gatherings of private jets landing near the locations of Bilderberg meetings. Still, no one could prove what was being discussed inside. The mystery only deepened, and with it, the fascination grew. Governments continued to deny any involvement, insisting that the Bilderberg Group was nothing more than a private forum for discussion. But as the decades passed, too many coincidences aligned: financial crises, policy shifts, wars launched and ended, all echoing the timing of their secret summits. The question was no longer whether the group existed. It was what their true purpose had become. By the dawn of the 21st century, the leaks were no longer just rumors. They had become evidence, fragmented, scattered, and often discredited, but evidence nonetheless. Enough to suggest that the plans forged in Oosterbeek in 1954 had evolved, spreading into every corner of modern governance. The world had changed exactly as they predicted. Economies merged, surveillance expanded, and democracy grew thinner by the year. The Silence Pact had worked for decades, but information, like truth, cannot stay buried forever. The more they tried to hide, the more people began to look. And somewhere in that growing chaos of leaks, lost documents, and forbidden testimonies, a new revelation was waiting, one that would finally expose what the first meeting in Oosterbeek had truly set in motion. The decades that followed the Oosterbeek meeting reshaped the planet in ways too precise to be coincidence. The lines drawn in that hidden conference room began to manifest in the real world through laws, alliances, and systems that promised progress but delivered control. To most, it looked like evolution. To the few who knew, it was orchestration. What had been whispered in secrecy in 1954 now echoed across every corner of civilization. In 1957, just 3 years after the Bilderberg meeting, the Treaty of Rome established the European Economic Community, the first major step toward a unified Europe. Politicians celebrated it as peace through cooperation, but its architecture mirrored the proposals drafted during those secret sessions. Shared markets, shared currency, centralized power. The dream of integration, born in Oosterbeek, was beginning to take shape. Across the Atlantic, similar forces were at work. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard, decoupling the dollar from physical reserves. On the surface, it was a financial decision. In reality, it marked the beginning of a system where money existed only through trust that could be managed, manipulated, and controlled by the few who dictated its flow. The foundations of global finance had become untethered from reality, just as planned. Technological expansion followed. Corporations that once competed began to merge, forming global monopolies capable of shaping consumer behavior and even thought. Media networks consolidated, narrowing the range of acceptable opinion. Governments adopted surveillance technologies once dismissed as science fiction, tracking citizens in the name of safety. And the public, lulled by convenience and comfort, barely noticed the shift. They didn't need to be forced into submission. They were guided into it. The wars that came after Vietnam, the Gulf, Afghanistan were no longer fought for land or liberty, but for influence, resources, and narrative. Each conflict strengthened global institutions, creating new forms of dependency and control. Private contractors replaced armies. Corporations replaced governments. The world had entered a new era where wars were not declared, but designed. By the 1990s, globalization was the new gospel. Borders blurred, currencies intertwined, and the same handful of corporations began to dominate every industry. International summits and global forums appeared, echoing the structure of that first Bilderberg gathering: exclusive, secretive, untouchable. The illusion of democracy persisted, but the machinery of power had moved elsewhere, operating behind curtains of diplomacy and public interest. The rise of the digital age brought new possibilities for control. Information became the most valuable resource on Earth, and those who controlled it could shape reality itself. Algorithms began to dictate what people saw, thought, and believed. Data replaced gold as the measure of wealth. The invisible hand of the market had evolved into an invisible eye one that watched everything and everyone in real time. And through it all, the Bilderberg Group endured. Every year, they continued to meet, adapting to each new world they had helped create. Their guest lists expanded to include tech magnates, media moguls, and heads of global organizations. Presidents came and went, but the attendees remained the same, the faces behind the curtain, the architects of consensus. What began as a single meeting in a small Dutch village had become a tradition, a ritual of control that transcended nations and generations. Those who tried to expose them were silenced, discredited, or absorbed into the system they opposed. Some disappeared entirely. Others learned that resistance was futile, that the game had been rigged long before they entered it. The few documents that surfaced were dismissed as fabrications. The truth had become indistinguishable from the myths surrounding it. That was the genius of the system. It didn't need to hide anymore. It simply blended with normalcy. Today, we live in a world shaped by decisions made in secret rooms. Our economies, our freedoms, even our fears have been calibrated by invisible hands. The New World Order is not a prophecy, it is history. And though most people will never know its true beginning, the story always leads back to that quiet hotel in Oosterbeek, where, in 1954, a group of powerful men decided to redefine what freedom would mean for the rest of humanity. The world after 1954 didn't change overnight. It was shaped in silence, built layer by layer, until control became indistinguishable from progress. And as we look around today at our divided societies, our digital prisons, our endless wars, we must ask ourselves one final question: did they win? Or did we simply stop noticing that they did? Decades have passed since that quiet gathering in the forests of the Netherlands, yet its shadow stretches farther than ever. What began as a secret meeting has become the silent architecture of our world, a network of influence so vast, so subtle, that it no longer needs to hide. Nations still wave their flags, citizens still cast their votes, but the framework of power was set long ago, written not in laws or constitutions, but in agreements whispered behind locked doors. The men who met in Oosterbeek are long gone, but their vision lives on in the systems that guide us, in our economies, our technology, even in the way we think. The world they imagined was not one of tyranny, but of control through consent. They did not conquer humanity, they taught it how to obey willingly. And in doing so, they created something far more enduring than any empire. A world where freedom is an illusion maintained by the few who understand its value. If you've come this far, remember, truth has no voice unless it's spoken. So before you leave, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because sometimes, the greatest conspiracies aren't theories at all, they're history.